The keypad blinked red 3 times before I gave up. 0419. My mother's wedding anniversary. The code that had opened that garage door for 11 years. And now it sat there, flashing like it didn't know me at all. I stood in the driveway of the house I grew up in 9-degree Ohio wind, holding a garment bag with my father's funeral suit still wrapped in dry cleaner's plastic, and I could not get inside my own childhood home. My father, Walter Bennett, had died on a Tuesday. A widowmaker, the ER doctor called it. A blockage in the left anterior descending artery that gives you almost no warning and no mercy. 1 minute he was standing in the garage, arguing with the router about a warped board, and the next he was on the concrete floor. And by the time the paramedics got him breathing again in the ambulance, it was already too late for the parts of him that mattered. He died 2 hours later at St. Vincent's, and I was 3 states away in a client meeting when my mother finally called. 4 hours after it happened, because she said she didn't want to worry me at work. That was Tuesday. This was Friday night, and I was locked out. I walked around to the side gate, past the rose bushes my father had babied every spring like they were something fragile and worth the trouble, and looked through the kitchen window. The lights were on. My younger sister, Chloe, sat at the island with a legal pad and 3 open folders, the kind with the little metal clasps, the kind that had lived in Dad's fireproof filing cabinet in his office since before I could drive. Her husband, Derek, leaned against the counter with a glass of my father's 25-year Macallan in his hands, the bottle Dad had been saving for something, though he never said what. On Derek's left wrist, catching the light from the pendant lamp over the island, was my father's steel Omega. Dad had worn that watch to every job site, every client dinner, every one of my college graduations. Derek had buried him 3 days ago wearing a rented black tie, and now he was wearing my father's watch to drink my father's scotch at my father's kitchen island like he'd been fitted for the role. I knocked, not loud, just 3 even knocks, the way you knock on a door you have a right to walk through. My mother answered, chain still on, the gap between the door and the frame just wide enough to show me half her face. She had her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and a look on her face like I was a solicitor who'd caught her in the middle of dinner. "Ava," she said, "it's late." "My code doesn't work," I said. "I came to drop off Dad's suit for tomorrow, and I need the navy tie from his closet, the one with the small check. He wanted that one. He told me that at Christmas." "Chloe's handling the closet," my mother said. "She's handling everything right now. She needs to feel like she has some control, sweetheart. You understand that. This is very hard on her." "It's hard on both of us." "You have your job," my mother said, in the same tone she'd have used to remind me I had an umbrella if it started raining. "You're strong. You'll be fine. Chloe needs the house right now. She needs to not be managing people at the door." Behind her, through the sliver of hallway I could see, the light from the kitchen threw a long yellow rectangle across the hardwood, and I watched my sister's shadow cross it once, unhurried. A woman moving through a house that already, somehow, 3 days after our father's death and 11 days before any will had been read, felt entirely hers. "Mom," I said, "Derek is wearing Dad's watch." "Derek has had a very stressful month," my mother said, which was not an answer to anything, and then she closed the door, and I heard the deadbolt turn. I did not knock again. I did not call out. I stood on the porch in the cold with a suit bag over my arm, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, the way a building goes quiet right before a controlled demolition. All that noise and mess reduced down to one clean, silent countdown. I turned around, walked back to my car, laid the suit bag flat across the back seat so it wouldn't wrinkle, because whatever else was happening, my father was still going to be buried looking the way he wanted to look, and I drove home on roads the county hadn't salted yet. My name is Ava Bennett. I am 34 years old. I spent that Friday night locked out of the house I grew up in, while my sister sorted through my dead father's private files, and my brother-in-law drank his scotch wearing his watch. And I want you to hold on to that image, because in 11 days, a man in a gray suit was going to knock on my apartment door with a sealed envelope that would turn everything my family thought they'd won into something they never saw coming. They believed that Friday night that they had already claimed the whole of my father's life, the house, the cars, the accounts, the story of who he was. They had no idea there was a second estate. They had no idea my father had spent the last 4 years of his life building a trap so quiet, so patient, and so completely legal that by the time they understood what they'd signed, there would be nothing left to appeal. But before I tell you how my sister's greed cost her more than she ever imagined possible, I want to welcome you to Long Game Stories. If tales about toxic families getting exactly the reality check they've earned are your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. And I'd genuinely love to know, how old are you? And what's one boundary you had to set with your own family to protect your peace? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. To understand why I got back in my car that night instead of pounding on that door until my knuckles split, you have to understand the arithmetic of the Bennett family. Because it was never complicated. It was just consistent. Love, in our house, was not something that multiplied when you were generous with it. It was a fixed pie, and Chloe had been served first at every single sitting for 29 years. She was the baby, 5 years younger than me, and she had been born fragile in a way that never quite stopped being useful to her. As a kid, it was allergies and asthma, real ones, the kind that landed her in the ER twice before she was 6, and I don't begrudge a 6-year-old her inhaler. But the fragility calcified into an identity somewhere around middle school, and by the time she was in high school, Chloe wasn't a girl who'd had asthma. She was a girl things happened to. If she failed a class, the teacher had it out for her. If she wrecked the car twice, both times going 40 in a 25, the intersection was poorly designed. When her first business, a candle company she ran out of our parents' garage for 8 months, went under, owing 4 different suppliers, it was the economy. It was Etsy's algorithm. It was never, not once, anything Chloe herself had done or failed to do. I was 3 years older, and I was built from a very young age for utility. Not cruelty. My parents weren't cruel to me, not in any way you could point to and name. It was quieter than that. I was the one who didn't need managing. I got myself up for the school bus at 11 because my mother was dealing with one of Chloe's meltdowns. I did my own homework, drove myself to my own practices, filled out my own college applications at the kitchen table alone, while my parents took Chloe to a specialist 3 states away for a stomach issue that turned out, eventually, to be nothing a normal diet couldn't fix. Nobody ever sat me down and told me I mattered less. They just quietly stopped asking me what I needed, because I had stopped, somewhere around age 9, giving them a reason to ask. There's one incident from high school that I think crystallizes the whole pattern better than any general description I could give you. When I was 17, Chloe, then 14, borrowed my car without asking. My car, purchased with my own savings from 2 years of a part-time job at a hardware store, insured under a policy I paid the difference on myself, and hit a parked car in a church lot 3 blocks from our house, hard enough to total the front quarter panel and crack the headlight housing. She didn't have a license yet. She wasn't supposed to be driving at all, under any circumstances, and she certainly wasn't supposed to be driving my car. When my father found out, he was, for one of the only times I can remember in my entire childhood, genuinely, visibly angry. The kind of quiet, controlled anger that scared me more than shouting would have, because I'd almost never seen it directed anywhere in our house. He drove Chloe to apologize to the owner of the damaged car himself. He made her call the insurance company and explain, in her own words, what had happened. For about 4 days, I thought something in the family's basic physics might actually be shifting, that consequences might finally be landing where they were supposed to land. Then my mother stepped in. She pointed out that Chloe's testimony to an insurance adjuster could follow her for years, that a formal claim against a 14-year-old with no license could create complications with the church, whose pastor was a family friend, that the whole situation was spiraling out of proportion for what was, in the end, just a car. Within a week, the plan had quietly reshaped itself into something else entirely. My father paid the other driver's deductible directly, out of pocket, in cash, to keep it off any insurance record at all. And I paid, out of my own savings, the $1,100 my insurance deductible required to fix my own car, because filing a claim through Chloe, unlicensed, would have raised my premiums for years in a way that wasn't fair to me, which was the specific phrase my mother used, apparently without any sense of the irony sitting directly underneath it. Chloe never spoke to the other driver again. She never paid a cent toward the repair. Within 2 weeks, the whole incident had been folded so completely into family silence that by the following summer, when it came up at a barbecue, my aunt made a joke about it, and Chloe laughed along like it was a funny story about a fender bender, rather than the exact blueprint for how consequences would keep working, or failing to work, in our family for the next 15 years. I went into structural and civil engineering, and now I do risk assessment for a regional infrastructure firm. Bridges, retaining walls, load calculations on aging highway overpasses. The kind of work where a mistake doesn't just cost you money, it costs someone their life. So you learn very early to strip the sentiment out of a decision and look only at what the numbers actually say. It is not a job that leaves a lot of room for magical thinking. Either the beam holds the load or it doesn't. Either the math works or the bridge comes down. I bring that same instinct into the rest of my life, whether I want to or not. And that Friday night, sitting on my childhood porch in the cold, being told I was strong enough to handle it, the numbers were already telling me something. I just didn't yet know how large the real structure underneath our family actually was. I drove home. My phone stayed silent the whole way. No text from my mother asking if I'd made it back safely on the ice. No apology from Chloe. Nothing. That silence was its own kind of message, and I understood it perfectly. They believed they had already finished with me. They believed that whatever came next, the will, the house, the accounts, was simply a formality that would confirm what they'd already claimed with a chain lock on a door. They had no idea the real estate hadn't even been opened yet. Monday was the funeral, and Monday was also, though none of us knew it yet, the day the invoice would come due, in more ways than one. The funeral home smelled like carpet cleaner and lilies, the specific oversweet combination that I will now never be able to separate from grief for the rest of my life. Mr. Halloran, the funeral director, sat behind a heavy desk that was too big for the room, and he slid a cream-colored folder across the polished wood toward the three of us, me, my mother, my sister, with the particular gentleness of a man who does this exact thing 4 times a week and has never once found a way to make it feel less brutal. The total was $14,190. The mahogany casket my father had specifically picked out 2 years earlier, after his own father's funeral, saying he never wanted my mother fussing with cheap pine. The flowers, the plot fees, the obituary placement in 3 papers. Mr. Halloran cleared his throat and explained, in the soft, over-rehearsed cadence of a man who has explained this exact fact to 1,000 grieving families, that my father's bank had placed an administrative hold on his primary accounts pending probate, which was standard, which happened every time, and that someone would need to guarantee payment today so the service could proceed on schedule tomorrow. Chloe shifted in the leather chair beside me, and the fabric of her dress, black, new, the kind of structured crepe that doesn't wrinkle in a garment bag because it's never been folded, made a small, expensive sound against the leather. She was looking at the framed diploma on the wall behind Mr. Halloran's head, not at the invoice, not at me, not at our mother. "We can't really absorb something like this right now," Chloe said. "Derek and I are already stretched. The kids have activities. It's just not a good month." My mother put a hand on Chloe's knee and nodded along, the way you'd nod along with a doctor confirming a diagnosis you already suspected. I looked at the two of them. 3 days earlier, they had locked me out of a house that legally still belonged to my father's estate. 3 days earlier, Chloe had been sitting on the living room floor with folders that belonged in a fireproof safe I did not yet have the combination to. And now, over a stack of funeral bills for the man whose files she'd been quietly digging through, my sister was telling me she couldn't absorb the cost of burying him. "You're the one with the corporate job, Ava," Chloe said finally, turning to look at me for the first time since we'd sat down. Her voice had no heat in it at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. "You don't have kids. You can float this." The room was quiet, except for the low hum of an air conditioner running somewhere in the walls, working overtime in a Midwest February for reasons I never understood. My mother did not object. She adjusted the silk scarf at her collar and waited, with the calm of someone who has done this exact maneuver so many times she no longer even registers it as a maneuver, for me to yield. I reached across the desk. I picked up Mr. Halloran's pen. I signed the guarantor line, pulled my card from my wallet, and told him to run it. I didn't sigh. I didn't argue. There was, frankly, no version of that room where arguing would have changed the outcome, and I had learned a long time ago not to spend energy on outcomes I could already model with total confidence. Chloe exhaled, slow and even, and settled back into the leather chair. She smoothed the cuff of her new dress. It was a small motion, almost nothing, but the message underneath it was loud and completely clear. She had tested whether I would fold, and I had folded, exactly the way I always did, and as far as she was concerned, that confirmed the natural order of things for whatever came next. She had no idea how wrong she was about what whatever came next was actually going to look like. The funeral itself passed the way these things do, in a blur of organ music and rehearsed condolences from people who mostly knew my father through his business, rather than through the particular way he used to whistle off key while he worked in the garage. I sat at the far end of the front pew, leaving a deliberate gap between myself and my mother. Derek sat on Chloe's other side, checking his phone twice during the eulogy, the gold band of my father's watch flashing under the sanctuary lights every time he lifted his wrist. Nobody else in that church seemed to notice or care. I noticed. I have always been the kind of person who notices the load-bearing details other people walk past. Afterward, there was a reception in the fellowship hall, the kind with a coffee urn the size of a fire hydrant and trays of cut fruit nobody touches. And I spent most of it fielding the same conversation on a loop. People would take my hand, tell me how sorry they were, tell me my father had been so proud of me, and then, almost without exception, they would ask when Chloe and Derek were planning to settle back in to the house. As if it had already been decided, as if the entire town had received a memo I'd somehow missed. I found out later that they had, in fact, received something like a memo. My mother had been telling people for 2 days that Chloe and Derek were taking over the house because it made the most sense with the kids and the school district, and that I was doing wonderfully on my own and didn't need to be worried about. Nobody had asked me if I agreed with any of it, because in my family, my agreement had never actually been a required input. It was assumed the way you'd assume a load-bearing wall would keep holding up the ceiling without anyone checking on it, right up until the day it didn't. 2 days after the funeral, on a gray Wednesday morning, we sat in the office of my father's longtime attorney, Gerald Whitfield, for the reading of the will. Whitfield had drafted my father's original estate documents almost 15 years earlier, back when Bennett Precision Tools was still a struggling 5-employee machine shop in a rented unit off Route 8. And I remembered him vaguely from childhood as the quiet man in glasses who used to come to our house for dinner once a year and talk to my father in a low voice behind the closed door of the study. He read through it efficiently. The house, fully paid off, to Chloe. My father's 2019 Range Rover to Chloe. The joint checking and savings accounts, roughly $210,000 combined, split 80-20 in Chloe's favor. In recognition, the document read, of her greater ongoing financial need as a parent. My mother would retain her own separate accounts and continue living in a condo she and my father had purchased for her use 2 years earlier, apparently in anticipation of some transition neither of them had ever discussed with me. And to me, Ava Bennett, the will left my father's collection of hand tools, his 1998 Ford F-150, and such personal effects as she selects with her sister's agreement. That was it. That was the entire visible estate, and by any plain reading of the document sitting on Whitfield's desk, my sister had just been handed a house, a luxury SUV, $168,000 in liquid cash, and me, the daughter who had spent 11 years and every ounce of unpaid emotional labor holding that family together, had been handed a pickup truck and permission to ask my sister's blessing before I took a single one of my father's belongings out of the house he'd raised me in. Chloe did not look at me. She looked at Whitfield and asked, with a kind of polite, businesslike efficiency that I found almost admirable in its shamelessness, when the accounts would be transferable, and whether the deed transfer on the house could be expedited, given that she and Derek were already functionally living there. My mother reached over and patted my hand once, the way you'd pat the hand of someone who'd just lost a modest bet, not someone who'd just watched her entire inheritance evaporate into a pickup truck and a box of wrenches. "You never needed the house, sweetheart," she said. "You've always taken care of yourself." I did not cry in that office. I did not argue with the document. I thanked Mr. Whitfield, shook his hand, and walked out into the parking lot, where the wind cut sideways off the lot and stung my eyes in a way that had nothing to do with what had just happened inside. And I sat in my car for 11 minutes without turning the key, doing something that had become almost reflexive to me over the years, which was running the numbers. Here's the thing about being the child who is never given anything. You get very good, very early, at building your own floor underneath yourself, because nobody else is going to do it for you. I had my own condo, purchased entirely with my own money, no help from anyone. I had a retirement account I'd been aggressively funding since 24. I had a job that would exist whether my family loved me or not. None of that made the moment in Whitfield's office hurt less. It just meant I wasn't going to let it break anything that actually mattered to my life going forward. I put the car in drive and I went home. And for the first time in 11 days, I let myself grieve my father instead of managing everyone around his death, alone, in my own apartment, with the lights off and a box of his tools sitting untouched on my kitchen table. I did not hear from Chloe or my mother for the rest of that week. No text checking in, no call. The silence again said everything it needed to say. They believed the matter was fully closed. They believed that whatever grief or resentment I was carrying was simply mine to manage quietly, the way I had always managed everything quietly, and that in a month or two I would fold this into the long, familiar shape of being fine about it, the shape I had worn my entire adult life. They had no idea that the will Gerald Whitfield read aloud in that office was only ever meant to be half the story. 8 days after the will was read, on a Thursday evening, someone knocked on my apartment door while I was still in my work clothes, standing at the counter eating leftover soup straight out of the container because I hadn't had the energy to sit down and use a bowl like a person with a functioning life. I checked the peephole expecting a delivery driver. Instead, I saw Gerald Whitfield, in a different suit than the one he'd worn the week before, holding a slim, black leather portfolio against his chest, like it was something that needed protecting from the weather. "Ava," he said when I opened the door. "I'm sorry to come by unannounced. Do you have 20 minutes? I let him in. He sat at my kitchen table, in the chair across from the one where I'd been eating cold soup, and he set the portfolio down in front of him without opening it right away, which told me, before he said a single word, that whatever was in it mattered enough that he wanted to choose his opening sentence carefully. "What I read in my office last week," he said, "was your father's will. It's a real, valid, fully executed legal document, and everything in it stands exactly as written. Chloe inherits the house, the vehicle, and the majority of the checking and savings balances. That part isn't going to change. And I want to be very clear that I'm not here to tell you otherwise." "Okay," I said, because I genuinely did not know where this was going, and my job has taught me not to fill silence with guesses. "But your father came to me almost 4 years ago," Whitfield went on, "and asked me to help him set up something separate from the will. Something that wouldn't be part of probate, wouldn't be part of the public estate filing, and wouldn't show up in that document I read last Wednesday. He was very specific that it needed to stay entirely outside the will. And he was very specific about why, though I didn't fully understand his reasoning myself until the last year or so, watching how things developed with your sister." He opened the portfolio. Inside was a single cream-colored envelope, sealed, with my name written across the front in my father's handwriting. The same handwriting I recognized from 3 decades of birthday cards and Post-it notes stuck to the garage refrigerator reminding me to lock up when I left. "Your father built Bennett Precision Tools from a 5-person machine shop into a company that, on paper, looks like a modest regional manufacturer," Whitfield said. "What most people don't know, including your sister, is that around 11 years ago, your father designed and patented a locking ratchet mechanism that ended up licensed into 3 major hardware retail chains nationally under a private label agreement he negotiated himself and never talked about at family dinners because he didn't want it changing how people treated him or his daughters. That licensing arrangement generates royalty income completely separate from the operating business, routed through a holding entity he formed called Bennett IP Holdings. It is not on the company's public balance sheet in a way anyone would notice unless they went looking specifically for it. Right now, That royalty stream is worth, conservatively, between $4 and $5 million over the life of the remaining patent term, with additional renewal options that could extend it further. I set my spoon down. I did not say anything for what felt like a long time, running the number through my head the way I'd run load calculations, checking it against itself for errors, because it did not sound like a number that belonged anywhere near my father's kitchen table conversations about warped plywood and rosebush fertilizer. 4 years ago, Whitfield continued, your father placed the entirety of Bennett IP Holdings into an irrevocable trust. He named you as the primary beneficiary and, more importantly, as sole trustee, effective automatically upon his death, with no probate process required and no dependency on the will whatsoever. This envelope contains his personal letter to you, along with a full copy of the trust documents, the licensing agreements, and instructions from your father about a provision inside the trust that I need to walk you through myself, because it's the part that matters most for what happens next. A provision, I repeated. Your father called it his fairness clause, Whitfield said. He built it because he knew exactly what would happen with the visible estate. He knew Chloe would end up with the house and the cash, and he knew you would end up, on paper, with almost nothing. He didn't try to fight that pattern directly, he told me once, that trying to force fairness onto people who've never practiced it themselves usually just makes things worse. Instead, he built a second door. The trust includes a clause stating that if, within 1 year of his death, Chloe voluntarily and verifiably shares a fair portion of the visible estate with you, and his language defines fair as a minimum of 30% of the combined value of the house, vehicle, and liquid accounts, then the trust automatically distributes 40% of the royalty income to her as well, permanently, alongside your 60%. He wanted to give her every real opportunity to choose decency on her own, without you having to ask for it or fight for it. And if she doesn't? I said slowly, already knowing the shape of the answer before he finished it. If the 1-year window closes without that voluntary transfer, Whitfield said, the clause locks permanently, and 100% of the trust, along with all future royalty income, remains solely and irrevocably yours. Chloe's opportunity simply expires. It doesn't reopen. There's no renegotiation, no appeal, no second chance built into the document, because your father was very clear with me that he did not want this to become a source of ongoing family litigation. He wanted one clean, quiet, time-limited test, and he wanted the outcome to depend entirely on what your sister chose to do once she believed nobody outside the family was watching. I sat there in my kitchen, in front of a bowl of cold soup I had completely forgotten about, holding an envelope with my father's handwriting on it. And I understood, in the specific, clinical way I understand a structural failure once I've traced it back to its origin point, exactly what my father had built. He had not left me out of his estate because he didn't value me. He had watched, for years, the exact dynamic that had defined our whole family, Chloe taking, me absorbing, my mother smoothing it all over, and instead of trying to argue anyone out of their nature at the 11th hour, he had built a structure that let that nature play itself out fully, on its own, with no interference from him and, for the next year at least, no interference from me either. There's one more thing, Whitfield said, and I could hear in his voice that this was the part he'd been building toward the whole conversation. Your father was aware that Bennett Precision Tools, the operating company itself, the physical business, the machine shop, the equipment, carries liabilities that don't appear on a casual read of the company's books. There's an outstanding equipment lease with an aggressive balloon payment structure, a pending supplier dispute worth close to $200,000 that's currently in arbitration, and a payroll tax irregularity from 3 years ago that the company's accountant has been quietly working to resolve with the IRS in a payment plan. None of that is fraud, and none of it is anything your father did dishonestly. Running a small manufacturing company through the last several difficult years meant making some hard, imperfect choices to keep people employed. But whoever ends up controlling that company inherits those liabilities along with it. And your father's will does leave Chloe, specifically, a 40% ownership stake in Bennett Precision Tools, structured as a separate line item, which I'm told your sister has not yet fully reviewed because she's been focused on the house and the accounts. I looked at Gerald Whitfield across my kitchen table, and for the first time since the whole terrible week began, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched so tightly for so long, I'd almost forgotten what its absence felt like. "She doesn't know about any of this yet," I said. "Not the trust, not the company's debts?" "No," Whitfield said. "And per your father's instructions, I'm not obligated to tell her unless she asks the right questions, files the right requests, or unless the ownership transfer paperwork on the company forces the issue into the open, which, given how quickly your sister and her husband appear to be moving to consolidate everything, I expect will happen relatively soon on its own." He slid the envelope across the table toward me. "Your father asked me to give you one piece of advice along with this, Ava, and I'll pass it along exactly the way he said it to me. He said, don't tell them anything. Don't warn them. Don't explain the fairness clause to Chloe hoping it will change her behavior. And don't try to protect her from the consequences of what she does next. He said you'd spent your whole life doing that job for her, and he wanted, for once, to let the two of them find out what the world looked like without you standing in front of the wreckage first." Before he left, I asked Whitfield the questions that my professional instincts refused to let go unasked, even in the middle of what was, for me, one of the strangest and most disorienting evenings of my adult life. "How did he keep this hidden for 4 years?" I asked. "Chloe works in the same town. Mom handled a lot of the household finances. Nobody noticed a holding company generating this kind of income?" "Bennett IP Holdings never touched the operating company's books," Whitfield said. "The royalty payments from the 3 retail licensing agreements went directly into the trust's own custodial accounts, managed by a financial institution out of Columbus that your father selected specifically because it wasn't the same bank the family used for anything else. Your father filed a separate, minimal personal tax return for the holding entity every year, which I helped him prepare, and which never crossed paths with the company's accountant or with any household financial documents your mother might have had access to. He was, frankly, extremely deliberate about it. I don't think there's a version of this where anyone in your family would have stumbled onto it by accident." "And the patent itself?" I said. "Where did that even come from? Dad ran a machine shop. I didn't know he invented anything." Whitfield smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since he'd sat down at my table. "He'd tell you it wasn't much of an invention. A modified locking mechanism for adjustable ratchets, something he came up with solving a problem on his own shop floor, back when a batch of tools kept slipping under torque. He filed the patent himself, almost as an afterthought, and then a regional buyer from one of the big retail chains happened to see a prototype at a trade show your father almost didn't attend, because he thought it was a waste of a Saturday. The licensing deal that came out of that trade show is the reason this trust exists at all. Your father used to say the whole thing was 90% luck, and 10% being annoyed enough by a slipping ratchet to actually do something about it. I think that undersells him considerably, but that was how he told the story." "What happens if I decide I don't want it?" I asked, because even sitting there with the number already changing the shape of my future, some old, deeply worn part of me needed to know whether accepting it was actually a choice or simply the next box I was expected to check. What if I wanted to split it evenly with Chloe myself, right now, without waiting for any of this to play out? You're the sole trustee, Whitfield said. Legally, you could do exactly that, today, if you chose to. Your father built the fairness clause as an option for Chloe to exercise, not a cage for you. Nothing in this document requires you to wait a year, or to stay silent, or to let anything unfold the way he hoped it would. That instruction came from him, personally, as a request, not as a legal condition. If you called me tomorrow and told me you wanted to transfer half the trust to your sister immediately, I'd draft the paperwork by the end of the week. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, because I think it mattered to me, more than almost anything else in that conversation, that the choice was actually mine, and not simply a second version of the same script I'd been handed my entire life. I'm not going to do that, I said finally. Not because I don't love my sister. Because for the first time in my life, somebody built something specifically so that I wouldn't have to be the one deciding to absorb the cost of somebody else's choices before they'd even made them. I think I want to actually find out what that feels like, all the way through, before I go back to doing it the old way. Whitfield nodded slowly, like this was the answer he'd been hoping to hear, without wanting to influence it either direction. Your father thought you might say something close to that, he said. For what it's worth, I think he'd have been relieved to hear it. I did not open the envelope while Whitfield was still in my apartment. I waited until he'd gone, until the door had clicked shut behind him and I was alone, in the quiet, with the box of my father's tools still sitting untouched on the counter. And then I sat back down at my kitchen table and I opened it. And I read the letter my father had written to me 4 years before he died, in the same handwriting from every birthday card I'd ever received from him. And for the first time in 11 days, I actually cried. My father's letter was 4 pages, handwritten, and I am not going to pretend I remember it word for word because I have read it so many times since that the exact sentences have blurred together into something closer to a feeling than a memory. But I remember the shape of it. He wrote that he had watched me since I was small, absorb every hard thing in our family without ever once being asked whether I wanted to carry it, and that by the time he understood what he'd allowed to happen, the pattern was already so old it felt like furniture nobody thinks to question anymore. He wrote that he loved Chloe every bit as much as he loved me, and that this was precisely the problem, that loving her had somehow always translated, in our house, into protecting her from ever having to be uncomfortable, while loving me had translated into trusting me to handle discomfort on my own. And that he had come, late in his life, to understand those were not the same thing at all, and that one of them had done real, lasting harm. He wrote that he wasn't leaving me out of the will to punish me, and he wasn't leaving Chloe the house to reward her. He was doing what he believed, rightly or wrongly, was the only experiment left that might actually tell him, and eventually tell me, the truth about who his younger daughter had become as an adult, away from the buffer he and my mother had spent 30 years building around her. He wrote that if Chloe chose to share what she'd been given, he would consider his gamble on her character to have paid off, and he would be, in whatever way a dead man can be, enormously relieved. And if she didn't, he wanted me to know that the trust wasn't built as a punishment for her. It was built as a floor for me, one I would never again have to build for myself out of nothing, the way I always had. The last paragraph was the one that undid me. He wrote that he was sorry it took him this long to see clearly, and sorrier still that he wouldn't be there to watch how it turned out. But that whichever way it went, he wanted me to walk into whatever came next without guilt, because I had never, not once in 34 years, taken more than what was fairly mine, and he was done letting that be treated, by anyone, including himself, as something ordinary rather than something rare. I want to correct something I said a moment ago, because it isn't quite true. I told one person, eventually, though not right away. I was seeing someone at the time, a man named Marcus I'd been dating for a little over a year, a structural inspector I'd met through a mutual colleague, someone steady and unbothered by the particular brand of controlled, analytical calm I bring into most rooms, which not everyone finds easy to be close to. Marcus knew, in broad strokes, about the locked door and the will because I'd needed somewhere to put the immediate shock of that first week. But I hadn't told him about the trust, not for the first month, because some part of me needed to know I could hold it entirely by myself first, without leaning on anyone. The same reflex that had shaped almost every important moment of my life up to that point. I finally told him over dinner, about 5 weeks after Whitfield's visit, watching his face carefully while I did it, half expecting to see some shift in how he looked at me once the number was actually out loud in the room between us. He didn't react the way I'd braced for. He didn't ask about the money at all, not really, not beyond a single practical question about taxes. What he asked instead was whether I was doing okay carrying a secret that large entirely by myself, and whether I wanted him to just be someone who knew, quietly, in the background, or whether I wanted him more actively involved in thinking it through with me. Quietly, for now, I told him. I need to know I can actually hold this on my own before I let anyone else help me hold it. That's very on brand for you, he said, not unkindly, and reached across the table and took my hand and didn't say anything else about it for the rest of the night, which was, I think, exactly the right response, and one of the reasons I eventually married him 2 years later in a small ceremony on the property in Nebraska, standing in almost the exact spot where my mother and I had once walked through cold spring wind and finally started to say something true to each other. Marcus was the one who sat with me through the hardest stretch of that waiting year, the months between the August phone call and the February deadline, when watching my family's collapse unfold from a careful distance felt less like vindication and more like a low, constant test of nerve. There were nights I told him I didn't think I could keep doing it, that some old reflex in me wanted to just call Chloe and tell her everything and make the whole slow-motion disaster stop. Not because I thought she deserved rescuing, but because watching someone drown, even someone who has hurt you badly, does something uncomfortable to a person who has spent her whole life as the one who jumps in first. "You're not the one drowning her," Marcus said, more than once, in more or less those exact words. "You're not required to be the lifeguard for a pool you didn't build and didn't fill. You're allowed to just be a person standing on the shore, watching, without that automatically making you the villain of the story." I didn't always believe him in the moment, but I held on to the sentence anyway, turned it over on the nights it was hardest, and eventually, somewhere around November, I noticed I'd started to believe it without having to remind myself first. I put the letter back in its envelope and I did not tell my mother, or Chloe, or anyone beyond that single quiet exception, what it said. I went to work the next Monday, ran my usual load assessments on a bridge retrofit in the eastern part of the state, sat through a 2-hour design review meeting without a single person in the room able to tell that 4 days earlier, my entire understanding of my father had quietly reorganized itself around a document he'd hidden for 4 years. I had been given a year-long window in which the only thing required of me was to do absolutely nothing. And it turned out that doing nothing, for once, was the single hardest and most disciplined thing I had ever been asked to do. Chloe moved fast. Within 3 weeks of the will being finalized, a moving truck sat in the driveway of our childhood home for 2 full days, while she and Derek brought in new furniture, a sectional the size of a small boat, a dining set that looked like it belonged in a catalog shoot rather than a house with 2 kids under 10, and had my father's old study, the one with the built-in bookshelves he'd made himself out of reclaimed oak, gutted and repainted into what Chloe's Instagram captioned as Derek's home office/gaming lounge. I only knew any of this because my mother, apparently under the impression that keeping me informed of Chloe's renovations was a kindness rather than a small daily cruelty, texted me photos unprompted, captioned things like, "Doesn't it look wonderful?" and "Your sister has such an eye." They traded in the Range Rover, which was only 2 years old and still under a lease my father had been paying down responsibly, for a brand new one on a fresh 60-month term, plus a second vehicle for Derek, a truck with a price tag that made my stomach turn when Chloe mentioned it at a family dinner I'd been guilt-tripped into attending by my mother, 3 weeks after the funeral. Derek had, in the intervening time, quietly stepped back from whatever consulting work he'd been doing and started referring to himself, at that dinner, as helping Chloe run the business now. Though as far as I could tell from the outside, helping run the business mostly consisted of him showing up at Bennett Precision Tools twice a week in expensive sneakers and rearranging the front office furniture. I sat through that dinner mostly in silence, which nobody at the table seemed to find unusual, because silence from me had never once in my life been read as anything other than agreement. Chloe talked at length about her plans for the company. She wanted to modernize the brand, rebrand the logo, move the office out of the industrial park where it had operated for 20 years into a more elevated space closer to downtown. And she wanted, she said, to finally take the equity out of the house to fund all of it, because Dad basically handed us a free house. It makes no sense to just sit on that kind of leverage. My mother nodded along, the way she'd nodded along at the funeral home over the invoice, and said something about how proud my father would have been to see Chloe finally stepping into her own. Nobody at that table asked me a single question about my work, my life, or how I was handling my own grief, which by that point had stopped surprising me and had simply become the ambient weather of every family gathering I had ever attended. What none of them knew, sitting around that table eating a roast my mother had clearly spent all afternoon on, was that I had, 3 days earlier, quietly transferred 60% of a $4 million royalty trust into an account under my sole control, that I had already spoken with a financial advisor and an estate attorney of my own about how to structure it responsibly, and that the entire time Chloe described her plans to leverage a house she had held for barely a month, I sat there running her numbers against the ones Gerald Whitfield had described to me about the company's hidden liabilities. And I understood, with the same clean certainty I feel when I look at a stress diagram and already know exactly where the failure point will be, that I was watching someone take out a loan against a foundation that had already quietly begun to crack. I did not say a word. My father had asked me for one thing, and I intended to give it to him. Spring came, then summer, and from a careful distance I watched my sister build exactly the kind of structure that any competent risk assessment would have flagged in the first 30 seconds. She took out a home equity line of credit against the house for $240,000, most of which went toward the office relocation, a new logo, a rebrand from Bennett Precision Tools to something called Forge & Co. that she'd apparently paid a branding consultant $18,000 to develop, and a company-wide launch party held in the lobby of the new downtown office space, complete with a signature cocktail named, unbelievably, The Chloe. I wasn't invited. I found out about the party from a public Instagram post my mother had liked, showing my sister in a blazer holding a champagne flute under a new neon sign that spelled out the rebranded company name in cursive script, captioned, "New Era, New Energy. Dad would be so proud." I sat with that caption for a long time. I thought about the man who used to whistle off-key in the garage, who saved his best scotch for something he never named, who spent 4 quiet years building a legal structure specifically because he understood exactly what this new era was going to look like before any of us did. And I did not think he would have been proud of a neon sign. I think he would have recognized, immediately and with a familiar, tired sadness, exactly what he'd predicted. I want to tell you about something that happened at my own job that spring, because it ended up shaping how I understood everything unfolding inside my family more than almost anything else that year. In late March, I was part of a 3-person team assigned to do an emergency load assessment on a 60-year-old truss bridge in a small county about 90 minutes from where I lived, after a routine inspection had flagged visible corrosion on 2 of the main support gussets. We spent 4 days out there in cold, miserable weather, running strain gauges, cross-referencing the original 1960s engineering drawings against decades of maintenance records that hadn't always been kept as carefully as they should have been, trying to determine whether the bridge could safely stay open to the kind of heavy agricultural truck traffic that used it every single day, or whether it needed to be closed immediately. What struck me most, standing underneath that bridge in the cold with a headlamp and a notebook, was how much the corrosion had been developing quietly, invisibly, for years before anyone noticed anything wrong on the surface. The deck looked fine. The paint looked fine. Cars and trucks had been driving over it every day for a decade without incident, and most of the people crossing it had absolutely no idea that underneath the part they could see, small failures had been accumulating steadily the entire time, hidden inside the structure, waiting for exactly the wrong combination of load and time to finally announce themselves all at once. We ended up recommending the bridge close for emergency repairs, and it did, for 11 weeks, which caused a genuine, visible hardship for the farmers and small businesses that relied on that crossing every day. I remember sitting in my truck in the gravel lot beside the bridge that final evening, filing my report, and thinking, with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable in how directly it applied to my own life, that this was exactly the shape of what was happening inside my family, just on a different kind of structure. Nobody had inspected the load Chloe was actually carrying in a very long time. Nobody had checked whether the foundation underneath her, 30 years of rescue, 30 years of never once being asked to sit with a real consequence, could actually bear the specific weight of adulthood, of a company, of a mortgage, of a marriage under financial strain. The paint had looked fine for years. The corrosion had been happening quietly the entire time, underneath a surface nobody in my family had ever bothered, or been willing, to look closely at. I didn't share that comparison with anyone at the time, not even Marcus, because it felt too raw and too personal to say out loud in a work context, surrounded by colleagues who knew nothing about the sealed envelope sitting in a drawer in my apartment. But I carried it with me for the rest of that year, and I think it's part of why I was able to hold the boundary I held with Chloe and my mother as steadily as I did. An engineer doesn't get to feel guilty about recommending a bridge closure just because the closure is inconvenient for the people who'd rather keep driving across a structure that's quietly failing underneath them. You tell people the truth about what the structure can actually bear, even when the truth is unwelcome. Because the alternative, letting people keep driving across it, hoping it holds, purely to avoid an uncomfortable conversation, is how bridges eventually fail catastrophically instead of safely, on your own terms, with warning. I drove past the new downtown office once, about 3 weeks after the launch party, on my way back from a client meeting that happened to route me through that part of the city, and I sat at a red light long enough to actually look at it properly. The space took up the ground floor of a converted warehouse building, all exposed brick and oversized windows, with the new Forge and Company logo etched into the glass door in a thin, expensive-looking script that had clearly cost someone $18,000 to design. Through the window, I could see a lounge area with a leather sectional and a coffee bar that looked like it belonged in a boutique hotel rather than a manufacturing company's front office. And beyond that, through a half-open interior door, I caught a glimpse of a second room where 2 people in business casual sat at laptops, presumably the brand strategy hires Ron had mentioned, doing whatever it is brand strategists do for a machine shop that still, underneath the new paint, made its money bending and cutting steel. What struck me most, sitting at that light, wasn't the extravagance of it, though the extravagance was obvious enough. It was how completely disconnected the whole space felt from anything my father had actually built. There was nothing in that window that told you what the company did or made or promised to the people who relied on it. There was no version of that lobby where Ron or any of the machinists who'd spent decades on the actual shop floor would have felt like the space had been designed with them in mind at all. My father used to say that a good business, like a good bridge, should tell you everything you needed to know about it just by looking closely. The materials, the craftsmanship, the honesty of the structure underneath the surface. Whatever Chloe and Derek had built in that converted warehouse told you a great deal about how they wanted to be perceived, and almost nothing at all about what the company actually did or how well it was actually built to last. The light turned green. I drove home, and I didn't go back. The cracks started small, the way they always do. And the way they always do, nobody who was inside the structure noticed them until it was much too late to reinforce anything. In April, one of the company's 2 longest-tenured machinists, a man named Ron who had worked the floor at Bennett Precision Tools for 19 years and who my father used to bring home leftover birthday cake for every October, quit without notice. And 2 weeks later, a second machinist followed him out the door. I heard about it secondhand, through a mutual family friend who still worked adjacent to the industry, that both men had left specifically because the new owners had cut the shop floor's overtime budget to help fund the office relocation, while simultaneously bringing in 2 new brand strategy hires who, as far as anyone on the production floor could tell, had never once set foot on it. In June, the supplier dispute that Gerald Whitfield had mentioned to me in my kitchen finally moved out of arbitration and into a formal judgment. Bennett Precision Tools, now operating as Forge and Company, owed a steel supplier out of Youngstown $194,000 plus legal fees for a contract dispute dating back to before my father's death. A dispute my father had been quietly and steadily negotiating down before he died, and that nobody on Chloe's side had thought to review before rebranding the company that owed the money. I learned about the judgment because my mother, still apparently seeing no contradiction in keeping me updated on a business I had been given no ownership stake in, forwarded me a screenshot of a court filing with the caption, "Isn't this ridiculous? Some old supplier thing? Chloe says it's basically nothing." It was not basically nothing. $194,000. On top of a rebrand that had already eaten most of the home equity line, on top of 2 lease payments, the house's new mortgage-adjacent debt, and the balloon-structured equipment lease Gerald had told me about, that were both coming due on overlapping timelines nobody on Chloe's side appeared to have modeled against the company's actual cash flow. I did not need to see their books to know the shape of what was coming. I had spent my entire career reading exactly this kind of structure, watching load after load get added to a foundation that had never been designed to carry it, and knowing, with total professional certainty, the range of dates within which something was going to give. In July, the IRS payroll tax irregularity that had been quietly moving through a manageable payment plan under my father's stewardship came up for a routine compliance review. The kind of review that, handled correctly, is a minor administrative inconvenience, and handled incorrectly, by two new owners who had missed a filing deadline while they were busy planning a launch party, becomes a much larger problem very quickly. I heard, again through my mother, that Chloe had gotten a scary letter from the IRS and that Derek was handling it, which, given everything else I now understood about Derek's actual contribution to running the company, did not fill me with confidence. By August, 10 months after my father's death, 2 months short of the 1-year window closing on the Fairness Clause sitting untouched in Gerald Whitfield's office, my sister had a company drowning in liabilities she had never bothered to fully review, a house carrying more debt than it had a year earlier despite having been handed to her free and clear, 2 brand-new vehicle leases and, as I would find out very soon, a marriage that was carrying a great deal more weight than anyone outside it realized. And she had not, in 10 months, sent me a single dollar, a single message, or a single acknowledgement that anything about the way the estate had been divided might have been worth revisiting. If you've been with me this far, thank you, genuinely. And if you haven't already, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because the next part of this story is where everything my father built quietly starts closing in around the people who thought they'd already won. I also want to ask you something, because I think about it a lot. Has your family ever had an unspoken favorite? Someone whose mistakes always got explained away while yours got filed under, "You're strong, you'll figure it out." Tell me in the comments. I promise I read them. Word travels fast in a town the size of ours, and by that summer, my father's small manufacturing business and my sister's rebrand of it had become a mild, low-grade topic of local interest. The kind of thing that got mentioned at the grocery store and the hair salon and, inevitably, at every extended family gathering my mother still insisted on hosting. My father's older sister, my Aunt Carol, called me in June, ostensibly to check in on how I was doing, and spent the first 10 minutes of the call doing what Aunt Carol had always done best, which was narrating the family's business back to me, as though I might not already know it firsthand. "I heard Chloe changed the name of your father's company," Aunt Carol said. "Forge and something. Your father spent 30 years building that name, you know. Bennett Precision. People in 3 counties knew what that name meant on a piece of equipment." "I know, Aunt Carol," I said. "And I heard she's spending money like it's water. New cars, new office, some kind of party with a signature drink, if you can imagine your father ever approving of a signature drink for a machine shop." She paused, and I could hear the specific weight of what she was about to say building behind her next sentence, the way you can sometimes hear a beam groan before it gives. "I always thought it should have gone to you, honestly. You were the one who understood what he actually built. Chloe just liked being able to say her family owned it." I didn't say much in response, because there wasn't anything productive to say, and because some old habit in me still didn't want to be the one who fed the gossip mill any more material than it already had. But I noticed, over the following months, that Aunt Carol wasn't the only one who'd started to see the shape of things clearly from the outside, even without knowing about the trust. My father's old business partner from decades earlier, a man named Frank, who'd since retired to Florida, sent me a card that fall, out of nowhere, that just said, "Heard about the company. Your dad would want you to know none of that was ever really the point of what he built." Hope you're doing all right, kid. I kept that card. I still have it, tucked into the same drawer where, once upon a time, an 11-year-old second-place science fair ribbon used to live, before it got put away to protect somebody else's feelings. My mother, for her part, spent that summer performing a kind of public optimism about Chloe's rebrand that I understood, even then, was less about genuine belief and more about her own long-standing need to keep the family story looking intact from the outside. The same instinct that had made her hand me a sugar cookie instead of an apology for over 2 decades. She hosted a 4th of July barbecue that year, the first big family gathering since the funeral, and I went, mostly because Priya convinced me that avoiding my whole family indefinitely wasn't actually the boundary I wanted, just the easiest one. Chloe spent most of the party talking to a cluster of neighbors about the exciting direction of the business, gesturing with a glass of white wine, describing 5-year growth projections that, I now understood watching the equipment lease numbers Whitfield had described to me, had almost no chance of surviving even 5 more months. Derek stood near the grill in a way that struck me, even then, as slightly too relaxed for a man managing a company under that much quiet financial pressure. And at one point, without meaning to, I caught myself staring at my father's watch on his wrist again, and I thought, distinctly and without much emotion attached to the thought at all, that's not going to be there much longer. And I had no real evidence for that yet. Nothing beyond the numbers I'd built in my head from a handful of overheard details. But I had spent my career learning to trust exactly that kind of quiet, evidence-based instinct, and it had never once steered me wrong. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late August, my phone rang, and it was Chloe, for the first time since the reading of the will. "Hey," Chloe said when I picked up, in a voice pitched somewhere between casual and careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed an opening line in her car before making a call. "It's been a while. I feel like we should catch up." We had not, in 10 months, caught up about anything. I let the silence sit for a second longer than was comfortable, a habit I'd picked up from years of client negotiations, and then I said, "Sure. What's going on?" She told me, in a version that took almost 15 minutes and looped back on itself twice, about the supplier judgment, the IRS letter, a temporary cash flow issue with the equipment lease, and a home equity line that had, in her words, gotten a little bigger than we planned. She never once used the word mistake. Every sentence was structured the way her sentences had always been structured, since she was 9 years old wrecking a bicycle she'd been told twice not to ride down the hill behind our old house. Something had happened to her. Some external force had acted upon her plans, and now she needed help absorbing the consequences of a decision she still, 10 months later, did not appear to fully understand she had made. "I know things have been weird between us," Chloe said finally, arriving at what I now understood was the actual point of the call. "But you're doing so well, and family should help family, and I hate asking, but is there any way you could help us bridge some of this? Just short term, just until the rebrand really takes off." I thought in that moment about the exact same phrase from my childhood. Every time Chloe wrecked something, mine or hers, our mother would take a sugar cookie out of the same battered blue tin that had lived on the same kitchen shelf for as long as I could remember, hand it to me, and tell me to be the bigger person. "Put it in the tin, sweetheart. Let's move forward as a family." I had eaten more of those cookies than I could count over the years, had swallowed more anger down with sugar and butter than any single person should have to. And I understood, listening to my sister's voice on the phone that August evening, that she was asking me, in essence, to hand her a cookie of my own, to smooth over 10 months of silence and a full year of her taking everything and giving nothing. Because family should help family. As long as I was the only member of the family who was ever expected to do the helping. "Chloe," I said, "you inherited a fully paid-off house, a new car, and over $160,000 in cash. In the same conversation, our mother told me I was strong enough to figure out my own life without any of that. So I did. I'm not sure what part of my last 10 months makes you think I owe you a bridge loan for a rebrand I wasn't consulted on and don't own any part of." "It's not like that," Chloe said, her voice sharpening slightly. "You know I've always struggled more than you. It's not fair to hold that against me now, when I actually need you." "You've never needed me before," I said. "You've needed things from me. That's different." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I could hear, faintly, the sound of a television in the background of wherever she was sitting. "Mom said you'd probably say something like this," Chloe said finally. "She said you've gotten cold since Dad died." "Tell Mom I said thank you for the character assessment," I said, and I hung up. My mother called 40 minutes later, and I let it go to voicemail. And then she called again, and I let that go to voicemail too. And then a text came through. "Ava, your sister is drowning and you are the only one who can help her. I don't understand why you would let pride get in the way of family. Your father would be devastated." I read that text 3 times, standing in my kitchen, in the exact spot where Gerald Whitfield had sat across from me 8 months earlier and told me the true shape of what my father had actually built. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that my mother had spent my entire life mistaking my silence for consent, and that this text was simply the latest version of a chain lock closing on a door. I did not respond to the text. I did not send money. I did not call my sister back the next day, or the day after that, or at all for the rest of that month. My father had asked me for one thing: do nothing. Let the year run its course. Let the two of them find out what the world looked like without me standing in front of the wreckage. And for the first time since I'd opened his letter, I understood that boundary wasn't a punishment I was inflicting on my family. It was the only structurally sound decision available to me. The only one that didn't guarantee I'd end up absorbing a load I had never agreed to carry, and had, this time, every legal and moral right to set down. September brought the kind of collapse that, once it starts, doesn't so much accelerate as reveal how much of the structure had already failed quietly, underneath the surface, for months before anyone was willing to look at it directly. The equipment lease's balloon payment came due on the 18th. $131,000 all at once for machinery the company needed to keep running its remaining contracts. Forge & Company didn't have it. The home equity line, tapped almost to its limit for the rebrand, couldn't cover it either, not without triggering a separate default on terms Chloe had apparently signed without reading closely enough to understand the acceleration clause buried in paragraph 14. The bank, unmoved by a neon sign or a signature cocktail, called the loan. I found out what happened next in pieces, the way you find out about most disasters in families like mine. Not through anyone telling me directly, but through my mother's increasingly frantic phone calls, which I answered maybe 1 in every 4 times, enough to stay informed without volunteering myself as anyone's financial rescue plan. The equipment lessor initiated repossession proceedings on half the shop floor's machinery in the first week of October, which meant Forge & Company could no longer fulfill 2 of its largest remaining manufacturing contracts, which meant the revenue that might have covered the Youngstown supplier judgment simply stopped materializing, which meant that judgment, still unpaid, escalated into a lien against the company's remaining assets. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, in a detail that even I, with my professional habit of expecting structural failure, hadn't fully anticipated, it came out that Derek had not, in fact, been helping run the business for the past year in any meaningful operational sense. He had been quietly siphoning off distributions from the company's dwindling accounts into a series of cryptocurrency trades that he had told no one about, not even Chloe, and had lost, according to what my mother eventually admitted to me in a conversation that had clearly cost her a great deal to have, somewhere in the neighborhood of $90,000 over 8 months, chasing a recovery that never came. When Chloe found out, in late October, going through the joint accounts trying to figure out where a chunk of the company's remaining cash cushion had actually gone, she filed for divorce 11 days later. She called me the night she found out, before I'd told her I knew anything about the trust, before any of that had come out into the open between us. And it was the first time in months her voice on the phone hadn't been reaching for something from me. She just needed somewhere to put the shock. "He's been trading crypto with company money for 8 months," she said, and I could hear, underneath the flat delivery, the particular kind of numbness that comes right before a person actually lets themselves feel the size of something. $90,000, Ava. He told me he was renegotiating a supplier contract every time he disappeared into the office with his laptop. I believed him. I actually believed him for 8 months while he was losing money we didn't have. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it, because whatever distance had grown between my sister and me over the previous year, I had never once wanted this particular kind of blindside for her. "I keep thinking about the launch party," she said. "The stupid signature cocktail. I stood there in that new office telling everyone how proud Dad would be. And the whole time, Derek was already down $30,000, $40,000, and I had no idea. I didn't check. I just trusted him. The same way I trusted that the house would always just be there. The same way I trusted the business would basically run itself as long as it looked good from the outside." She laughed. A short, unhappy sound with nothing funny underneath it. "I don't think I've ever actually checked anything in my whole life, Ava. Not really. I think I've just always assumed somebody else was checking it for me." I didn't say anything to that. Not because I didn't have a response, but because I understood. Listening to her say it out loud, unprompted, without me having to point it out or argue her into it, that she had arrived at something true entirely on her own, for maybe the first time in either of our adult lives. And I didn't want to get in the way of her actually sitting with it. "I'm going to file," she said. "Tomorrow, probably. I can't keep doing the thing where I just absorb whatever he decides to do and hope it works out. I think I finally understand a little bit of what that's felt like for you all these years. I'm sorry it took me this long to get it." It was the closest thing to a real apology she'd offered me since our father died, buried inside a much bigger crisis that had nothing directly to do with me at all. And I remember sitting with my phone against my ear in my dark kitchen, feeling something in my chest loosen slightly. Not because her marriage was ending, which brought me no satisfaction at all, but because for one honest minute on a difficult night, my sister had finally looked directly at a pattern she'd spent her whole life inside of, without anyone standing over her shoulder, forcing the realization on her. It didn't fix anything between us that night, but it was, I think, the first real crack of light in a wall that had been solid for a very long time. I want to be honest with you about something here, because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant when I heard about the divorce. I want to say I did, because it would make a cleaner story. But grief and vindication are strange, uncooperative neighbors. And mostly what I felt, hearing about my sister sitting alone in a house she could no longer afford, having just discovered her husband had quietly gambled away a piece of the only financial cushion she had left, was something closer to a tired, familiar sadness. The specific sadness of watching a pattern you recognized from very far away finally arrive at its obvious destination. The house went into foreclosure proceedings in November. Not because Chloe had missed the original mortgage, the house had come to her fully paid off, but because the home equity line cross-collateralized against the property to cover the rebrand and, it turned out, several of Derek's crypto margin calls that Chloe hadn't known he'd made using the house as leverage had gone into default alongside the equipment lease. Forge and Company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy the first week of December, 10 months and 3 weeks after our father's death. Liquidating what remained of the machinery, the downtown office lease, and the branding assets that $18,000 had purchased less than a year earlier. The 40% ownership stake in the company that my father's will had left to Chloe was now, functionally, a 40% stake in a liability rather than an asset. A debt she was personally exposed to in ways that would take her years, potentially, to fully untangle. The bankruptcy filing was a matter of public record, and in a town the size of ours, public record has a way of becoming public conversation faster than anyone involved would like. My mother told me, in the same phone call where she first admitted she didn't understand how any of it had happened, that she'd stopped going to her usual Tuesday morning coffee with 3 women she'd known for over 20 years, because the last time she'd gone, one of them had gently, carefully, asked how Chloe was holding up through everything, in a tone that made it clear the entire group already knew far more about my sister's finances than my mother had ever told them herself. Aunt Carol called me again that December, less gossipy this time, mostly just sad, and told me she'd run into Ron at the hardware store and he'd asked after the Bennett girls in a way that made her realize how completely the shop floor's version of the story, the missed overtime, the 2 machinists who'd quit within weeks of each other, the neon sign nobody in town had asked for, had already spread through exactly the kind of small, interconnected community my father had spent 30 years quietly serving. I felt, more than once that December, a strange, complicated pull to defend my sister publicly, to correct the version of the story that was clearly circulating, the one that painted her as simply reckless or foolish. Because I knew the fuller version, the trust, the fairness clause, the year-long window she never once thought to look for. And some old part of me wanted, out of pure family loyalty, to make sure people understood there had been more to it than just a spoiled daughter blowing through an inheritance. I never did. Partly because the trust's terms genuinely weren't public information, and it wasn't mine to share without her consent. But partly, too, because I understood that protecting Chloe's reputation in the town's eyes was, in its own smaller way, exactly the kind of absorbing I'd spent my whole life doing without being asked. And I had promised myself, walking out of Whitfield's office the day I signed the guarantor line on my father's funeral invoice, that this particular year was going to look different, all the way through, even in the small moments nobody else would ever know I'd navigated differently. I did go see her once, in the middle of all of it, in early December, a few days before the bankruptcy filing became final. Not because she asked me to. I drove to the 2-bedroom rental she'd moved into with the kids, unannounced, on a Sunday afternoon, and I stood on a much smaller porch than the one I'd once been locked out of, and I knocked. And when she opened the door and saw me standing there, her face did something I hadn't seen it do since we were kids. A kind of unguarded surprise, without any performance layered over it. "I'm not here to give you money," I said, before she could ask, because I wanted that boundary stated clearly and immediately, without ambiguity, before either of us said anything else. I just wanted to see you. And the kids, if that's okay. She let me in. The rental was small and a little sparse, boxes still stacked in one corner from the move, but it was clean and warm, and her kids ran up to show me a fort they'd built out of couch cushions with the specific, uncomplicated enthusiasm kids bring to small spaces that adults are still mourning. I stayed for about 2 hours. We didn't talk about the business or the trust or the divorce in any detail. We talked about the kids' school, about a recipe she was trying to make work on a much tighter grocery budget than she was used to, about nothing in particular, the way sisters talk when they're not actively managing a crisis between them. And when I left, she walked me out to my car and stood in the cold without a coat on for a minute, hugging her arms around herself. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know I don't really get to ask you for anything right now. I'm not going to. I didn't expect you to show up anyway, and it meant something that you did." "I know things are hard right now," I said. "I'm not going to fix this one for you, Chloe. I don't think that would actually help you, even though it would be the easier thing for both of us in the moment. But I'm not gone. I wanted you to know that, too." She nodded and didn't argue and didn't ask for anything else, and I drove home that evening with a feeling I hadn't expected to have that year at all. Somewhere underneath the grief and the discipline and the long, careful silence, something that felt, cautiously, like the earliest, smallest version of hope that my family might eventually find a way to be honest with each other that didn't require anyone drowning first. I ran into Chloe once during that stretch, by accident, in the parking lot of a grocery store in early November, a few weeks after the divorce filing and a few weeks before the bankruptcy became official. I almost didn't recognize her at first. She was loading a modest number of grocery bags into the back of a used sedan I didn't recognize, nothing like the leased Range Rover she'd been driving 18 months earlier. And she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or sleep. The specific bone-deep tired of someone doing arithmetic in her head at every hour of the day that never quite comes out even. She saw me before I could decide whether to duck between the cars and avoid the whole interaction, and for a second neither of us said anything, just stood there in the cold with our carts between us like a small, awkward fence. "Hey," she said finally. "Hey," I said. "How are you holding up?" It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, and I think she heard the difference because her face did something complicated, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite gratitude either. "I've had better years," she said. "The kids ask about the old house sometimes. I don't really know what to tell them yet." I didn't offer her anything in that parking lot. I didn't say a word about the trust, though it sat in my chest the entire time like a stone I was carrying carefully so it wouldn't clatter against anything. I asked about the kids, and she told me about a school project one of them was working on, and for about 90 seconds, standing between two shopping carts in a cold parking lot, we managed to be simply two sisters talking, without any of the old architecture pressing down on either of us, and it was, strange as it sounds, one of the more peaceful moments either of us had had with each other in over a year. "I should get going," she said eventually, closing her trunk. "It was good to see you, Ava. I mean that." "You too," I said, and I meant it too. And I drove home that afternoon turning the whole strange, small interaction over in my head, because it was the first time since the funeral that I'd felt something toward my sister that wasn't managed, or strategic, or braced for the next request. It was just sadness, plain and uncomplicated, for someone I still loved even while I refused to step underneath the weight she was carrying. And I let myself feel all of it, the whole drive home, without trying to solve it, which was, for me, its own small kind of progress. My mother called me on the second Tuesday of December, and this time I picked up because something in the pattern of the calls had shifted. Fewer demands, more just the raw sound of someone trying to make sense of a version of the world she had never once modeled as possible. "I don't understand how this happened," she said. "Your father worked so hard for that company. How did she lose all of it in less than a year?" I thought about telling her, in that moment, everything Gerald Whitfield had told me 8 months earlier in my kitchen. The trust, the fairness clause, the 11 weeks left before it locked permanently and irreversibly in my favor. I thought about it seriously, for the first time since I'd read my father's letter, because some old, worn-down part of me still wanted, even then, to manage the crisis, to smooth it over, to be the one who explained things so nobody else had to sit in confusion. But I had promised my father one thing, and there were still 11 weeks left on the clock. And I understood, with the same clean certainty I'd felt in Whitfield's office, that the kindest and most honest thing I could do for my mother, and for myself, was to let her sit in that confusion for exactly as long as it took her to start asking herself real questions instead of easy ones. "I don't know, Mom," I said, which was, strictly speaking, not entirely true, but was true enough for that particular Tuesday. "It sounds like it's been a really hard year for her." "You could still help," my mother said, and her voice had lost the sharp managerial edge it had carried in August. It sounded now almost pleading. "She's your sister." "I know she is," I said. "I've never once forgotten that." I did not send money. I did not offer to co-sign anything, guarantee anything, or absorb a single dollar of what my sister and her soon-to-be ex-husband had built and then dismantled over the course of 10 reckless months. For the first time in my adult life, I let a member of my family fall all the way down without stepping underneath them to break the landing. And it was, without question, the hardest and most disciplined thing I had ever done. And it was also, I understood even as I was doing it, the only decision on the table that was actually mine to make freely, rather than one extracted from me under the old familiar pressure of being the one who was always, automatically, strong enough. The 1-year window on my father's fairness clause closed on the 14th of February, quietly, on a Friday, with no fanfare and no ceremony, exactly the way my father had designed it to close. Gerald Whitfield called me that afternoon to confirm, formally, that the clause had lapsed, that no voluntary transfer of at least 30% of the visible estate had ever been made to me by my sister, and that per the trust's irrevocable terms, 100% of Bennett IP Holdings, along with all present and future royalty income from the licensing agreements my father had spent a career quietly negotiating, now belonged solely, permanently, and legally to me. "There's no obligation for you to tell her," Whitfield said. "The trust doesn't require disclosure, and frankly, most of my clients in situations like this choose not to. But I know your father hoped, in whatever way is left to hope for once you're not around to see it, that this would eventually come out in a way that let your sister actually understand what happened, rather than just experiencing the financial fallout of her own bankruptcy without ever connecting it to a decision she made and didn't even know she was making." I thought about that for a few days. I want to be clear that I did not, in the end, tell Chloe out of any impulse toward mercy, and I did not tell her out of any impulse toward cruelty either. I told her because I had spent an entire year holding a piece of information that fundamentally reshaped how both of us should understand everything that had happened since our father's death. And I decided, in the end, that the honest thing, the thing my father, for all his careful engineering, might not have fully accounted for, was that people deserve to know the actual shape of the decisions they made, even after the window to change course has already closed. I asked Gerald Whitfield to set up a meeting in his office with Chloe present, and I told him I wanted to explain the trust myself. She showed up 10 minutes late, in clothes that were noticeably less expensive than anything I'd seen her wear in the 18 months since the funeral. Her hair pulled back in a way that read more like exhaustion than style. The bankruptcy proceedings had finalized 6 weeks earlier. She was living, temporarily, in a 2-bedroom rental with her kids, splitting custody logistics with Derek, whose divorce had also finalized, and whose whereabouts, as far as I understood, involved a studio apartment and a job selling cars, a fact my mother had relayed to me with a kind of stunned, quiet horror that suggested she still hadn't fully absorbed how far things had actually fallen. Whitfield said this was about the estate, Chloe said, sitting down across from me at the same conference table where, a little over a year earlier, our father's will had been read aloud. I thought we were done with all of that. There's a part of it you never knew about, I said, and I let Gerald Whitfield take it from there, because I wanted her to hear the actual legal terms from someone whose job it was to state facts precisely, not from a sister she might assume was exaggerating or embellishing for effect. I watched her face move through the whole arc of it, confusion, then disbelief, then, as the specific dollar figures landed, something that looked almost like physical pain. As Whitfield explained the trust, the royalty income, the fairness clause, the 30% threshold, and the 12-month window that had quietly opened the day our father died and had, 6 weeks earlier, quietly and permanently closed. "He gave me a chance," Chloe said finally, very quietly, staring at the table rather than at either of us. "This whole time. There was a version where I just gave you 30% of the house and the accounts, and none of this happens. None of it. The company, the bankruptcy, none of it." "Yes," I said. "And you knew. This whole year, every time I called you, every time I asked for help, you already knew there was a door that would have fixed everything, and you just let me not find it." "I let you make your own decisions about how to treat me," I said. "The same way you'd made your own decisions for the entire previous 10 months before that phone call. I didn't create the fairness clause, Chloe. Dad did, because he'd already watched you make this exact choice in smaller versions for 29 years. And he wanted to see, once, without me managing the outcome for you, what you'd actually do when nobody was around to absorb it for you." She didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally looked up, there wasn't the sharp, calculating expression I remembered from the funeral home. The one that had told Mr. Halloran's invoice was my problem to solve. There was something rawer than that, something closer to the face of a person finally doing the arithmetic on a decision that could never be revised. "I could have just asked you," she said. "At any point. I could have just said, 'Hey, this doesn't feel fair. Let's split it more evenly,' and none of this would have happened." "You could have," I agreed. "You never did. Not once in a year did you offer me anything without also asking me for something bigger in the same breath." I did not say this to punish her further. I said it because it was, simply, the truest thing I knew about the entire year, and because I understood, finally and completely, that my father's clause had never really been a trap for Chloe at all. It had been a mirror, held up at exactly the angle where she would either see herself clearly for the first time in her adult life or look away entirely, the way she always had, and let someone else absorb the cost of not looking. She left Gerald Whitfield's office that afternoon without asking me for money. That, more than anything else that happened in the 18 months since our father's death, felt like the first genuinely honest moment I'd witnessed from my sister in longer than I could remember. My mother did not take the news well when Chloe finally told her, and I want to be honest that a part of me had braced for that long before it happened. She called me the following Sunday, and her voice on the phone had none of the pleading quality it had carried in December. It had gone back, fully and immediately, to the tone she'd used on the porch that first freezing Friday night. The tone that assumed my compliance as a starting condition rather than something that needed to be earned. "You let your sister lose everything," she said, without any greeting at all. "You had the ability to fix this the entire time, and you sat there and watched it happen, and you didn't say a word." "I didn't cause any of it, Mom," I said. "Chloe took out the loans. Chloe approved the rebrand. Derek made the trades. I didn't sign a single document that led to any of what happened to them." "But you knew," my mother said. "You knew about this trust, this fund, whatever it is, and you let her destroy her whole life without telling her there was another way." I stood in my kitchen, in the same spot where I'd read my father's letter 14 months earlier, and I felt something in me that had been bending for 34 years, finally, quietly, refused to bend any further. "Mom," I said, "for as long as I can remember, whenever Chloe hurt me, you took a cookie out of that blue tin and handed it to me and told me to be the bigger person. I ate a lot of cookies. I have been the bigger person my entire life, at every single family dinner, every holiday, every crisis, starting long before Dad ever got sick. I paid for his funeral because nobody else in that room would. I got locked out of my own childhood home the week he died. I watched Chloe inherit a house, a car, and $200,000 while I inherited a truck and permission to ask her nicely if I could have Dad's tools. And through every single part of that, you told me I was strong enough to handle it alone, because handling things alone was the only role this family ever gave me. So I did. I handled this alone too. I am done being handed a cookie and asked to smile through it. If that makes me the villain in this particular story, I think I can live with that. Because I have spent 3 decades being the only adult in this family who never once got to be anything else. There was a long silence on the line. I did not fill it. I have gotten very good over the years at letting a silence sit exactly as long as it needs to sit. "I don't know how to talk to you when you're like this," my mother said finally, and her voice had gone thin, almost unfamiliar. "Then maybe we start by you asking me how I'm doing," I said, "instead of asking me to fix something I didn't break." She didn't have an answer for that. We didn't speak again for almost 2 months. When we finally did, it was my mother who called first, on a Sunday afternoon in April, and instead of asking me for anything, she asked if she could come out and see the property I'd bought, which by then had a foundation poured and framing going up. I said yes, mostly out of curiosity about what she actually wanted, and she drove out alone, without Chloe, and we walked the property together in a cold spring wind, and somewhere around the edge of what would eventually become my garden, she told me something about her own childhood that I had never once heard in 36 years. "My mother had a version of the cookie tin too," she said, not looking at me, watching the wind move through the bare trees at the property line instead. Except it wasn't cookies. It was a little porcelain figurine collection she kept on a shelf in the hallway. Whenever I was upset about something my brother did, and he did plenty, believe me, she'd let me pick one out and hold it for the rest of the day. I was allowed to be upset as long as I was quiet about it and held something pretty while I did it. My brother never had to hold anything. He just got to be upset out loud, and someone always came running. She stopped walking and pulled her coat tighter around herself, though I don't think the cold was really what she was bracing against. I didn't even realize I was doing the same thing to you and your sister until Chloe's whole life fell apart last year, and I kept asking myself how I could have possibly let it get that far without seeing it coming. And then I remembered the porcelain shelf, and I understood. I didn't invent this, Ava. I inherited it, the same way you're probably going to have to spend the rest of your life making sure you don't accidentally hand it down to anybody else. I didn't say much in response because I didn't fully know, in that moment, what to do with a version of my mother that had never once, in my entire life, offered me this kind of unguarded honesty. It didn't erase the porch, or the chain lock, or 30 years of a blue tin sitting on a kitchen shelf like a loaded piece of machinery nobody had bothered to inspect. But it did something else. Something quieter and, in its own way, more useful. It turned my mother, for the first time, from a fixed feature of my childhood into an actual person. Someone who had also been handed a set of instructions she never got to choose, and had simply followed them, imperfectly, for as long as she'd known how. "I'm not asking you to forgive everything today," my mother said, as we turned back toward the cars. "I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think you'd believe me if I asked for it. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what I did. All those years, I thought I was keeping the peace. I don't think I ever once asked myself what it was actually costing the person I kept asking to keep it." We stood by our cars for a few more minutes, neither of us quite ready to leave the conversation yet, and she asked me, almost shyly, if she could see the house plans once the blueprints were finalized. I told her she could. It wasn't reconciliation, not the full, tidy kind you see wrapped up neatly by the end of a video like this one. But it was the first honest brick either of us had laid towards something that might, eventually, with enough time and enough patience on both sides, actually hold weight. I never fully forgave her for the porch, and I don't think that's a failure on my part to say out loud. Some structural damage, once it's happened, simply becomes part of the permanent record of a foundation, something you build around and reinforce rather than something you pretend away. But I stopped needing her to have been a different mother than the one I actually had. And somewhere in that shift, something between us finally, quietly, started to hold. I want to tell you that this part of the story ends with a tidy reconciliation, the kind you see in a movie where everyone cries at a kitchen table and understands each other completely by the credits. It didn't. Not fully. And I think that's a truer ending than the tidy version would have been. My mother and I did eventually start speaking again, carefully, in smaller conversations that didn't reach all the way back into 30 years of pattern in a single phone call. She has never, to this day, fully apologized for the cookie tin, or the chain lock on the door, or the years of quietly treating my independence as a reason to give me less, rather than a reason to be curious about what I actually needed. But she has, slowly, started asking me questions she never used to ask. How work is going, whether I'm eating well, what I actually want for my birthday instead of assuming I'll say I don't need anything, which I always used to say, because for most of my life it had felt safer to want nothing than to want something and watch it go, once again, to someone else. Chloe and I are not close. I don't know that we ever will be. And for a long time, that fact sat in my chest like a stone I kept expecting to eventually stop noticing. She rebuilt slowly over the following 2 years, moving into a smaller rental with her kids, taking a job managing operations for a local distributor. The kind of steady, unglamorous work that doesn't come with a neon sign or a launch party, but does, reliably, cover rent. We speak maybe once every few months, mostly about the kids, mostly in the careful, measured tone of two people who used to share a childhood and now mostly share a set of facts they've both had to learn to live around. She has never asked me for money again. I think, in its own quiet way, that's the closest thing to an apology I'm ever going to get from her. And some days, that's enough. And some days, it still isn't. And I've stopped expecting either feeling to resolve itself permanently into the other. I started seeing a therapist that first winter, a decision I put off for almost 4 months after Whitfield's visit, because some deeply worn part of me still equated asking for help with failing at the one skill I'd built my entire identity around. Her name was Dr. Reyes, and in our 3rd or 4th session, she asked me a question that I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count since. What would it have taken, growing up, for someone in your family to actually check on you, instead of just trusting that you were fine because you never gave them a reason not to? I didn't have an answer for her that day. I sat with the question for almost the entire rest of the session in silence, which she let me do without pushing, and it took me weeks, honestly, to arrive at anything close to a real response. What I eventually told her was that I didn't think there was an answer. Not really. Not one that didn't require my parents to have been fundamentally different people than the ones raising 2 very different children with a finite amount of attention to go around. I told her I had made a kind of peace with that, or thought I had, long before my father died. There's a difference, she said, between making peace with a fact and making peace with what that fact cost you. You can hold both. You were fine, in the sense that you survived it and built a competent, successful life. That doesn't mean it didn't also genuinely hurt you, in ways that are allowed to matter on their own, separate from how well you turned out in spite of them. That distinction did more for me over the following year than almost anything else in this entire story, more, in some ways, than the trust itself. Because the money solved a very real, very practical problem, but it didn't touch the older one, the one where some reflexive part of me still equated my own needs with an inconvenience I should manage quietly, alone, before anyone else had to notice. Dr. Reyes was the person who helped me understand that setting the boundary with my mother and my sister wasn't simply a strategic decision built around a legal document. It was the first time in my adult life I was practicing, out loud, in real relationships, the basic idea that my own well-being was allowed to be a consideration in its own right, not just a byproduct of how well I managed everyone else's. I still see her every few weeks, even now, even with the land, the marriage, the version of my life that looks, from the outside, like it's already arrived wherever it was going. Old architecture doesn't fully rebuild itself just because the crisis that exposed it has passed. I think that's true for anyone who recognizes themselves in this story. And I wanted to say it plainly, because I don't think it's fair to the people listening to let this end sound like the money fixed everything, or like a single well-drafted trust document is the same thing as a real cure for 34 years of learning that your comfort mattered less than everyone else's convenience. The trust gave me a foundation. It didn't, on its own, teach me how to actually live inside a house built on it without still flinching, some days, at the sound of a door closing. I did something with the trust money that I think would have surprised my father, and I think, in the way I've come to understand him better since his death than I ever fully did while he was alive, it also would have made complete sense to him. I did not buy a bigger house in Cleveland, or a car to match the one Chloe had leased and lost. I bought 42 acres of quiet farmland an hour outside the city, land that had belonged to a retired couple who'd run a small orchard on it for 30 years and were finally ready to sell. And I spent a full year, alongside my regular engineering work, designing and overseeing the construction of a house on that land myself. Not because I needed a mansion, but because, for the first time in my life, I wanted to build something that was entirely, structurally, unquestionably mine, from the foundation up, with no one else's name anywhere on the deed. I remember the first time I walked the property alone, before I'd signed anything, before Priya had stood next to me in the tall winter grass, on a gray afternoon in early spring, with the previous owner's old dog trotting along beside me because he'd apparently decided I belonged there before I had. There was an old, half-collapsed apple orchard along the eastern fence line, gone wild after years of neglect, and a low rise near the center of the property with a view that stretched out over a shallow valley toward a line of trees that turned, I would learn that first autumn, a deep, specific red I'd never seen anywhere else. I stood on that rise for a long time in the cold, doing something I hadn't let myself do in months, which was simply imagine a future that belonged entirely to me, unattached to any version of the story my family had been telling about who I was supposed to be within it. I designed the house with an architect friend of Marcus's over the following winter, and I insisted, in a way that probably struck the contractor as unnecessarily particular for a residential project, on being present for the foundation pour myself, on a cold morning in early April, standing at the edge of the site in steel-toed boots, watching concrete fill forms I'd checked and rechecked the specs on 3 separate times. It is, I recognize, a strange thing to find emotional in a project this size. But I stood there, watching that pour, and thought about my father's fairness clause, about the whole architecture of my family's collapse and rebuilding, and understood that I was, in the most literal sense available to me, finally laying a foundation that no one else had any claim to, that couldn't be locked against me with a chain, that couldn't be reassigned in a will I wasn't consulted on. Every load-bearing decision on that property, for the first time in my life, was mine, checked by my own hands against my own judgment, and I have never once regretted a single choice I made building it. The house took just over a year to finish, through a winter of frozen ground and a summer of unexpected delays, and I moved in on a bright October morning with the maples along the eastern fence line just beginning to turn. Marcus and I got married there 2 years later, in November, under a tent set up on that same low rise, with Priya standing beside me and my mother, in a small, careful gesture that meant more to me than she probably ever fully understood. Wearing a dress in the exact soft green of the ceramic tin that used to sit on her kitchen shelf, which she later told me was not a coincidence at all, but the closest thing she knew how to offer as an apology without using the actual word. I also did something with a portion of the royalty income that I never told my mother or my sister about, and that I'm only comfortable saying now because enough time has passed that it no longer feels like it needs to be a secret. I set up a scholarship fund at the community college near where Bennett Precision Tools used to operate, specifically for machinists and manufacturing technicians, the kind of steady, skilled, unglamorous work that had built the actual value underneath everything my father ever accomplished. The kind of work Ron and the other machinist who'd quit within weeks of the rebrand had spent 19 years doing, without ever once getting a neon sign named after them. I named it after my father, quietly, without a press release or a launch party, because I understood, finally, exactly what kind of legacy he had actually spent his life building, and it had never once been about how things looked from a kitchen island with a glass of good scotch in your hand. I left my old engineering firm 2 years after my father died and started my own small structural consulting practice, focused specifically on rural and small municipality infrastructure, bridges and water systems in towns too small to attract the interest of the large national firms, the kind of unglamorous, unphotographed work that keeps a place standing without anyone ever noticing it's been done well. It is slower than the corporate track I'd been on, and it is, by any conventional measure, less lucrative than simply living off the royalty income my father left me would have allowed. But it is mine, built from the ground up, on my own terms, by my own hands, in a way nothing in my life had ever quite been allowed to be before. And there is a particular, specific kind of peace in that. One I don't think you can buy any other way, no matter how large the number sitting in your trust account happens to be. I still have my father's tools. I still drive the F-150, though it's got a lot more miles on it now. And I still keep his Omega, because Derek, in the settlement of his and Chloe's divorce, had ended up having to sell most of what he'd accumulated during their marriage to cover his own debts. And the watch, it turned out, had never technically belonged to him at all. Chloe found it going through a box of things Derek had left behind, and she mailed it to me without a note, 18 months after the funeral. And I understood exactly what it meant without her having to explain it. I wear it sometimes, on days when I need to remember that my father built something quiet and lasting underneath all the noise of our family, something none of the rest of us fully understood until it was the only thing left standing. People sometimes ask me, when they hear a version of this story secondhand, whether I ever worry that I've become the villain in it, the daughter who inherited millions and quietly let her sister lose everything without lifting a finger to stop it. I understand why the question gets asked. It's a fair one, and I don't think I owe anyone a defensive answer to it. What I usually say is this: I never once did anything to cause my sister's collapse. I didn't take out the loans. I didn't approve the rebrand. I didn't spend company money on cryptocurrency trades I hid from my own spouse. Every single decision that led to Forge & Co.'s bankruptcy, and to the foreclosure, and to the divorce, belonged entirely to 2 adults who made those decisions freely, with full legal capacity, without a single input from me. My only decision, in the entire year that followed my father's death, was to stop being the person who automatically absorbed the cost of choices that were never mine to begin with. That isn't villainy. It's the most basic form of self-respect there is, and it took me 34 years to learn how to practice it. I think, too, about what it would have actually meant to intervene, to call Chloe in September and tell her about the fairness clause before the window closed, to save her from the consequences my father had deliberately, carefully built into that trust. It would have felt kind in the moment. It would have also meant erasing the one thing my father had spent 4 quiet years designing specifically so that, for once, someone in our family could see clearly, without any interference, what actually happens when the safety net, finally, isn't there. I don't think real kindness always looks like softness. Sometimes it looks like getting out of the way and trusting that a grown woman is capable of surviving the natural result of her own choices, even when watching her do it is one of the hardest things you've ever had to sit through without flinching. Some evenings, out on the porch of the house I built on my own 42 acres, I think about that Friday night on my parents' front porch, the chain lock rattling against the frame, my mother's voice telling me I was strong enough to handle it alone. And I understand now that she was, in the strangest and most backhanded way possible, right. I was strong enough. I had always been strong enough. The problem was never my strength. The problem was that for 34 years, everyone around me had treated that strength as a resource to be spent on their behalf, rather than a quality worth protecting. And it took losing almost everything visible, the house, the will, the version of the family I thought I belonged to, for me to understand that the strongest thing I could ever do wasn't absorbing one more hard thing quietly. It was finally, after all those years, learning to set the weight down and let someone else feel exactly how heavy it had always been. I should back up because I don't think any of this makes sense without understanding exactly how deep the pattern went, long before my father ever thought about a trust or a fairness clause. There is a memory I keep returning to, from when I was 11 and Chloe was 8, that I think explains the entire architecture of my family better than anything that happened in the year after Dad died. We had a science fair at school, the kind where you build a volcano or a circuit board, and a parent is technically supposed to help, but mostly just supervise. I had spent 3 weeks building a working model of an irrigation system for a unit on agricultural engineering, because even at 11, I liked things that had a clear, testable mechanism to them. Chloe, at the last minute, decided she wanted to enter too, and she built, or rather, our mother built, over the course of one frantic Sunday night, a baking soda volcano. The most common project at any elementary school fair in America, the kind every other kid's older sibling had already made obsolete by 3rd grade. At the fair, my irrigation system won 2nd place in the whole grade. Chloe's volcano, assembled the night before by an adult, won nothing. And on the drive home, she cried the whole way. And by the time we pulled into the driveway, my mother had somehow transformed the entire evening into a referendum on how I had made my little sister feel bad about herself by showing off. I remember sitting in the back seat, 11 years old, being told that my 2nd place ribbon needed to go in a drawer instead of on the refrigerator because seeing it every day might upset Chloe. And I remember understanding in some wordless, structural way that I wouldn't have been able to articulate until much later in life, that in my family, being good at something and being loved for it were not actually connected the way I'd assumed they were. Being good at something, if it wasn't something Chloe was also good at, was a liability. My ribbon went in the drawer. Chloe got a special trip to the ice cream place that weekend to cheer her up. That pattern repeated itself in 100 smaller variations for the next 20 years. When I made varsity soccer as a freshman, my mother worried out loud in front of me about whether the schedule would take away from time Chloe needed for her own activities, even though Chloe wasn't playing a sport that year at all. When I got into a strong engineering program with a partial scholarship, my father was proud in the quiet, steady way he was proud of most things. But the celebration dinner got folded into a family dinner that was already happening because Chloe had a school event that same week, and my mother didn't want to split focus. I don't say any of this looking for pity, and I want to be careful here, because I know how this can sound if you've never lived inside a family with this particular shape to it, like I'm building a case, cherry-picking grievances to justify what came later. But I think it matters, because the fairness clause my father built into that trust wasn't really a punishment invented out of nowhere in his final years. It was, I've come to understand, an apology. It was the closest thing my father knew how to build to saying out loud, "I saw the drawer where your ribbons went." I saw it happening for 20 years, and I let it happen for too long, and this is the only language I know how to use to try to make it right before I run out of time. I told almost none of this to anyone while it was happening, in real time, during that terrible first year after Dad died. The one exception was my closest friend Priya, who I'd known since our first year of engineering school, and who had, over the following 15 years, become the closest thing I had to the kind of unconditional, uncomplicated support my own family had never quite managed to offer me. Priya sat with me on my kitchen floor the week Gerald Whitfield first came to my apartment with that sealed envelope, both of us leaning against the cabinets because neither of us wanted to move to the table. And she read my father's letter over my shoulder, twice, before either of us said anything at all. "You know you don't have to do what he asked," she said finally. "The silence part. You could tell Chloe right now, tonight, and save her from all of it. Nobody would blame you for that either." "I know," I said. "Are you going to?" I thought about it for a long time before I answered her, longer than felt comfortable in the quiet of my own kitchen. "I've spent my whole life warning people before they hit the wall," I said eventually. "Every single time. I've never once gotten to find out what happens if I just don't. I think I need to find out. Not to punish her, just to actually know, for the first time, what's true about my family when I'm not the one holding it up." Priya didn't try to talk me out of it, and she didn't tell me I was being cruel, which I think is part of why I trusted her more than I trusted almost anyone else in my life during that year. She just nodded and refilled both our glasses of wine and said, "Okay, then I'm going to be here for whatever that actually looks like, on either side of it." And she was. She was the person I called after the disastrous phone call with Chloe in August. The person who sat with me the week the bankruptcy filing became public. The person who drove out to see the empty 42 acres with me the first time I walked the property before I'd signed anything, and stood next to me in the tall winter grass and said, "This is going to be a good place for you to finally stop bracing for something." She was right. There were harder nights than the ones I've described so far. Nights I don't think fit neatly into the shape of a satisfying story, because grief rarely organizes itself around a clean narrative arc the way a video essay wants it to. There was a night in October, right around the time the equipment repossession was happening at Forge & Company, when I sat on my apartment floor and cried for almost 2 hours, not out of any triumph over my sister's collapse, but because I missed my father so specifically and so physically that it felt, in that moment, like a structural failure in my own chest, the particular way he used to hum off-key while sanding a piece of wood in the garage, the smell of the shop coat he wore over his good clothes so he wouldn't ruin them, the birthday cards in that same familiar handwriting that I would never receive again. Watching my family's slow collapse did not erase my grief. It ran directly alongside it, two separate and simultaneous processes, and there were nights that whole year when I genuinely could not have told you which one I was actually crying about. And I don't think, looking back, that it would have been honest of me to pretend otherwise. I say all of this because I think it's important, if you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own family in it, to know that setting a boundary like the one I set with my mother and my sister doesn't feel clean while you're inside it. It doesn't feel like justice being served in real time. Mostly it just feels like grief and discipline sitting next to each other in a quiet apartment, night after night, while you wait to find out whether the structure you're finally, for the first time, refusing to hold up on your own is actually going to stand or fall without you underneath it. My name is Ava Bennett. I am 36 years old now, And I live on land I bought with money my father hid specifically because he understood, better than any of us did while he was alive, exactly what our family would do with fairness if we were simply handed it outright. I did not inherit a house. I did not inherit a car, or a company, or a place at the head of any family table. What I inherited in the end was something my father built specifically for the daughter he'd watched hold everyone else's weight for 30 years, without ever once being asked what she needed in return. And it turned out to be worth infinitely more than a chain lock, a mahogany casket invoice, or a blue tin full of sugar cookies ever could have been. I want to step outside the story for a few minutes, because I think what happened in my family isn't really just a story about money, even though money is the part that makes for a satisfying video. It's a story about the quiet architecture that exists inside so many American households, hidden behind ordinary front doors in ordinary neighborhoods, where love gets rationed according to rules nobody ever writes down and nobody ever agrees to out loud. At the center of my family's particular version of this architecture was my mother's blue tin, and I think it's worth sitting with what that tin actually represented, because I don't believe my mother ever set out to raise an entitled daughter and sideline a capable one. I don't think any parent does. What happened in my house, and what I suspect happens in a great many houses that look, from the outside, like the ones on a holiday card, is a kind of unconscious triage. When a child struggles visibly and loudly, a certain kind of parent reads that struggle as an emergency, requiring immediate management, extra attention, extra grace, extra resources, all deployed to make the noise stop as quickly as possible. When a child struggles quietly, or worse, doesn't seem to struggle at all, that same parent reads the silence as evidence that nothing is actually needed there and redirects their limited attention toward whichever child is currently loudest. It is not, in most cases, active cruelty. It is closer to a kind of exhausted triage that never gets corrected because the quiet child never generates the kind of visible feedback that would force a correction. And because our culture, broadly, tends to reward parents for managing crises rather than for noticing the absence of one. The cost of that triage falls almost entirely on the quiet child, and it falls in ways that are very difficult to name until you're an adult with enough distance to finally see the pattern clearly. You learn, very young, that your needs are conditional in a way your siblings' needs are not. You learn that competence is not rewarded with more support. It's rewarded with less. Because competence reads, to an exhausted parent, as evidence you don't require any. You learn to solve your own problems before anyone notices they exist, because there is no guarantee anyone will step in if you don't. And eventually, that instinct calcifies into something that looks, from the outside, like admirable independence, and feels, from the inside, like a low, constant hum of loneliness you've simply stopped registering as unusual because you've never known anything else. Meanwhile, the child on the other side of that same triage learns an entirely different lesson, and it is, in its own way, just as damaging, even though it produces a very different set of adult behaviors. Chloe was never taught that her discomfort was ordinary, survivable, something every person has to learn to sit with and work through. She was taught that her discomfort was an emergency the rest of the family was obligated to resolve, immediately, on her behalf. That is a genuinely difficult thing to unlearn as an adult, because it isn't merely a bad habit. It's a fully internalized belief about how the world is supposed to work, reinforced for decades by people who loved her and were trying, in their own limited way, to protect her. When the world eventually stops cooperating with that belief, as it always eventually does, the resulting collision tends to be far more destructive than it would have been if the lesson had been corrected early and gently, at 8 years old, over a baking soda volcano, instead of at 29, over a bankrupt company and a lost marriage. I think this is why my father's trust affected me so deeply once I finally understood the whole architecture of it, because it wasn't built as revenge, and I want to be really clear about that, even though I understand why it might read that way on the surface. It was built as the first piece of genuine, uncomfortable honesty either of my parents had ever offered either of their daughters. My mother's entire parenting philosophy for 30 years had been built around avoiding exactly the kind of discomfort my father's fairness clause deliberately, intentionally created. He understood, I think, arriving at this understanding far too late to fix it while Chloe and I were still children, that the kindest thing he could do for his younger daughter as an adult was not another 20 years of quiet rescue. It was one clean, final, unambiguous test of her own character, run without an audience, without pressure, without anyone standing over her shoulder telling her what the right answer was supposed to be. Because if you have to be told what the right answer is in a moment like that, you were probably never going to choose it freely in the first place. And for me, the trust was something else entirely. It wasn't primarily about the money, even though I won't pretend the money hasn't changed my life in very real, very practical ways. It was the first time in 34 years that my father had built something specifically because of who I actually was, rather than around who I'd been forced to become in order to survive the family's particular arithmetic. Every other message I'd absorbed for 3 decades told me that my competence made me less deserving of protection, not more. The trust said the opposite. Finally, clearly, in writing, in a document a lawyer read aloud at my kitchen table. Your competence was never a reason to give you less. It was the reason I trusted you with more, because you were the only one I was confident would actually use it well. I think about the cookie jar, the blue tin in my case, as a kind of shorthand for a much larger cultural habit, one that isn't unique to my family at all. So many of us were raised in households that valued the appearance of harmony over the much harder, much slower work of actually resolving conflict. Be the bigger person, let it go, don't make a scene. These are, on the surface, reasonable-sounding pieces of advice, the kind that show up on inspirational posters in dentist office waiting rooms. But when they're deployed exclusively, decade after decade, onto exactly one child, while the other child is never once asked to be the bigger person about anything, they stop being wisdom and start being a mechanism. A very efficient, very quiet mechanism for making sure one person's discomfort always gets absorbed so that the family's surface can stay smooth. I ate a lot of cookies out of that tin over the years. I understand now, with the clarity that only distance and a little bit of expensive therapy can really provide, that every single one of those cookies was a small, sweet way of being told that my anger, my hurt, my sense that something in our house was fundamentally unbalanced, was less important than everyone else's comfort in not having to look directly at it. There is a broader question buried in all of this, one I think is worth asking regardless of whether your own family looks anything like mine. What does it actually mean to treat your children fairly? I used to believe, the way I think most people are raised to believe, that fairness meant equal division, equal attention, equal money, equal everything, split precisely down the middle regardless of circumstance. My father's will and his trust, taken together, argued for something more complicated and, I've come to think, more honest. Fairness isn't always the same as equality. Sometimes real fairness means giving people exactly what they've actually earned through their own choices, rather than what an arbitrary 50-50 split would hand them, regardless of how they've behaved. My father gave Chloe everything she'd spent her whole life chasing: the house, the car, the visible markers of success and comfort. And he attached to it exactly the kind of consequence that comes automatically, in the real world, to anyone who mismanages a windfall they didn't fully understand. He didn't punish her. He simply, for the first time in her life, declined to intervene before the consequence arrived, and let the consequence do the teaching that 30 years of cookie tins had never managed to do. I don't know that I fully agree with every part of what he built. There are nights, even now, when I wonder whether a gentler version of the same lesson might have reached Chloe without costing her quite so much: her marriage, her company, the sense of stability her own children had briefly enjoyed in that house before it went into foreclosure. I think that's a fair question to sit with, and I don't think my father would have wanted me to pretend it away, just because the ending, from my own vantage point, turned out to be one I could live inside comfortably. But I also think there's something important in recognizing that my father tried the gentler version first, for almost 30 years, in the form of quiet enabling disguised as kindness, and it never once produced the outcome he actually hoped for. Sometimes the people we love most only ever learn the lesson that finally sticks when the softer versions have all already been tried and have all already failed. If any part of this resonates with you, if you've ever been the quiet one, the capable one, the one who got told you were strong enough to handle it alone, while somebody else got handed a cookie and a soft landing every single time they stumbled, I want you to hear something clearly, because it took me 34 years and a locked front door in freezing weather to hear it myself. Your competence was never supposed to be the reason you got less. It should have always been the reason someone trusted you with more, the way my father, quietly and far too late, finally did. You are allowed to stop being the family's shock absorber. You are allowed to let people fall, even people you love very much, and discover on their own what gravity actually feels like without you positioned underneath them, permanently, absorbing an impact you never agreed to take on in the first place. Setting that boundary will very likely make you the villain in someone else's version of the story, at least for a while. Let them tell that version. It doesn't have the power to become true just because it's the one that's easiest for them to believe. I want to tell you 2 more small things before I let this story go, because I think they round out the picture in a way the big dramatic beats, the locked door, the trust, the bankruptcy, don't fully capture on their own. The first is about Ron, the machinist who quit within weeks of the rebrand. About a year after the bankruptcy finalized, I drove out to the industrial park where Bennett Precision Tools used to operate, in the old building before Chloe moved everything downtown, mostly just to see the space one more time before whatever came next for that building happened without my father's name on it anywhere. Ron was still working in the area, at a competing shop 2 units down, and we ended up talking in the parking lot for almost 40 minutes. He told me things about my father I'd never known. That Dad used to quietly cover a chunk of health insurance premiums for 2 employees going through hard years, off the books, out of his own pocket, and never told a soul, including, apparently, my mother. That he used to come in early on Saturdays sometimes, alone, just to walk the floor and make sure the equipment was running the way it should, not because anyone required it of him, But because he said a business was really just a promise you made to the people who showed up for it every day, and promises needed checking on. Your dad built something real here, Ron told me, standing in that cold parking lot with his hands jammed in his coat pockets. Not the name on the sign, the actual thing underneath it. I'm glad somebody in your family finally understood the difference. I didn't tell him about the scholarship fund. It didn't feel like the moment for it. But I thought about his words for a long time after I drove home that day. And I think, in a strange way, that conversation meant more to me than almost anything Gerald Whitfield ever told me in his office, because it confirmed something I'd needed confirmed since I was 11 years old with a ribbon in a drawer. That the parts of my father worth admiring had never actually been hidden. They'd just never been the parts anyone in my family bothered to look at closely. The second thing happened almost 3 years after Dad died, at my niece's 9th birthday party. The first family gathering where Chloe and I ended up alone together in the same room for more than a few minutes, standing near a folding table covered in half-eaten cake while the kids ran around the backyard. She asked me, out of nowhere, in a voice that had none of the old sharpness in it, whether I still had Dad's old toolbox, the wooden one he'd built himself when he was young, before any of us existed, before the company, before any of it. I do, I said. It's in my garage. I use it all the time, actually. I used to hate that you got that instead of, actual stuff, Chloe said, looking out at the yard rather than at me. I think I understand now why it mattered more than I gave it credit for. She didn't apologize outright, not in so many words, and I've come to understand that a full, explicit apology may simply not be a language my sister has ever been taught to speak fluently. But there was something in the way she said it, quiet, a little embarrassed, entirely without performance, that felt more honest than anything she'd said to me in the 18 months following our father's death combined. I didn't need her to apologize perfectly. I think I'd simply needed her, once, to actually see it. That afternoon, watching her kids chase each other around a yard that wasn't the house she'd lost, but was, in its own smaller way, steady and hers, I think she finally did. I want to say thank you, genuinely, for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you. Not just your age and your own boundary story, though I still want those too, but specifically this. Do you think my father's fairness clause was the right way to handle it? Or do you think there was a kinder version of the same lesson he could have chosen instead? I go back and forth on it myself, more than you might expect from someone telling the story from the winning side of it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if stories like this one, about the quiet reckonings that happen behind ordinary front doors, about the cost of being the reliable one, about what it actually costs a family to finally tell itself the truth, mean something to you. Hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this waiting for you. Protect your peace. Set the boundary even when it makes you the villain in somebody else's version of the story. And never, ever apologize for finally putting the weight down.